Three questions. Number one, are you on the way to ruin? Number two, what makes someone slip and fall in the first place? And then lastly, how does one become humble? Welcome to my channel, That Michelet Guy. If you've never been here before, what exactly do? We read the book of Proverbs, and we read it term by term, word by word, very slowly in Hebrew. And the reason we do this is because Hebrew is this very complex, layered language. And most of the time when these translations were done into English, they could only choose one meaning of these words, and they left the other ones out. So what we do is we go back in and restructure them in their full context and see that there's a lot of hidden wisdom when you read the Proverbs slowly. So we're going to go ahead and jump into today's lesson. This is Proverbs 16:18 from the King James English translation. It's pride goeth before destruction and a haughty spirit before fall. Very famous proverb, definitely probably top 25. Even people who do not read the Bible are familiar with this verse. And if we had to summarize it in a single sentence, how would we do it? Well, we'd say that arrogance will cause a person to collapse. And that would be an adequate teaching. That's what most people would take away and then move on to the next one. But that is not what we do here. So let's look at this in Hebrew now. In Hebrew, this is lifnei shever gaon velifnei kishalon gobah ruach. And word by word in the concordance, that is before, fracturing, pride, and before, stumbling, elevated spirit. So this first term, lifnei, this is a fronted preposition. This is going to explain the sequence, what happens first. And it's very unusual for a proverb to begin with a preposition. It's usually a noun or a verb. And as we cover in almost every single proverb, that first term that's laid down, it sets the tone for the proverb. It establishes the foundation. So this proverb in particular wants us to understand that there's patterns and then there's sequences, so that the order matters. And it's an interesting construction because the verbatim translation means toward the faces, the panim, but the figurative usage, it's time related. It's idiomatically, this means before. And so it's a spatial term that emphasizes that a person is traveling whatever direction they're facing. Before they can walk in that direction, they face it and it faces them, hence panim. It's going to establish that before one action can occur, something has to come before it. So in this sense, it's going to be destruction, but that it wants to establish that there's a destination that has a course that is traveled on step by step. And rather than lead with the destination, the proverb is going to lead with what brings a person to it. And this is a cautionary proverb. It's saying that if you want to intervene, you want to prevent this outcome, you have to require the pattern recognition, you recognize the causes, and you recognize the stages. So our next term is shever, and it means ruin or collapse or destruction. And this is a noun that's going to complete the construct, and it's saying that this is what the actions inevitably lead to. And so the primitive root for shever is sheber, which means to fracture, to break, or shatter. And in our last proverb, we discussed a word that was translated as destruction as well, and it's what we've talked about with Hebrew. They don't really have a lot of direct synonyms. So usually when you see one term used and not the other, the context really matters. So that last proverb, the term was mechita for destruction, and that's about a loss of position. It's about the emotional and psychological elements that a person feels inside, like while they're in the midst of collapse. It's a total breakdown, mainly internal, but their mood can recover, their position can be regained, and that context clue is going to matter because this term, destruction, shever, this is about a loss of functionality and stability. So this is about breakage, and the images of a destroyed vessel. It's in 1,000 pieces. It's smashed everywhere on the ground. And sheber, it's an external concussive force. So the ruin is more complete. It's a total shattering. And a lot of times this term gets translated into calamity or disaster. And a lot of Bible translations, particularly if it's a collective usage, like an entire people are destroyed. But when you see it in a single form, that's just talking about an individual's downfall. This is a collapse of one person's situation. And what shever does is it focuses on this identifiable structural weak point, and it's the vulnerability that causes the failure. And it's the images of an entire building just giving way, just snapping. And in this proverb, saying that the next term, which is pride, this is what's going to initiate the failure of the structure. The structure is the person himself, and his life is collapsing from this flaw, this pride. And pride is what made him brittle, and it's what made the structure itself vulnerable. And the proverb is naming the end point in the proverb. So we're going from finished to the precedent. It's going in reverse order, and it's telling us all the sequences that happened afterwards and the road that someone would have to travel to get there. So this is a roadmap with visible signs along the way. It's not a setback. This is total breakage, complete ruin. Shever. So our next term, gaon, gets translated as pride, but it's a predicate noun that it has this implied verb of is. It's explaining what something is. This proverb actually lacks a verbal structure, and it's saying that this is what precedes the fracture. And the primitive root is ga'a, which means to rise up, to exalt, to be very high above, or to lift something up. And it's an interesting term, and this is part of why we read these in Hebrew, because morally it's very neutral. The context and the usage is going to matter because exaltation can be good or it can be bad. So in the positive form of gaon, it's to say that there's majesty and there's glory. This is what someone does for God. Uh, it's something that God can assign to others, as He can exalt someone He's particularly proud of. But the negative form is where you most often see it, and that's the idea of self promotion, of arrogance, and that this is a prideful person self elevating. And so that's the context, is you have to discover who is being elevated and why, and who are they being elevated by, and then that's going to determine if the ga'a is rightful or if it's corrupt. And so this proverb established the outcome first, and then what immediately preceded it. And it wants to inform this intentional cause and effect connection, because that will eliminate the idea that this destruction was random. It's not. It wants to connect that correct worship will glorify and assign a correct position. But this is what brings destruction and collapse, this inner pride, the self-exaltation. And a person who's proud like this, saying it's going to feel like strength, but it's actually weakness in disguise. That this elevation is important. It's distorting their proportion, their image of their relative size, and it makes danger seem distant and correction seem unnecessary when you're puffed up, when you're prideful like this, and it changes what a person sees. And so their perspective is no longer grounded when they're prideful, and that perception's flawed. It's not just a behavior, this is a condition, and the sense of superiority is going to make this person feel untouchable, and they have this inaccurate view of reality. They have an inaccurate view of themselves, so that means that mistakes are inevitably going to be made. And when the fall occurs, the distance that they're falling down from increases the force of the impact, and they won't receive a small correction, they'll receive a shattering blow. Shevet. So they're like Humpty Dumpty, shattered. They cannot be reassembled. So our next term is where the proverb pivots to the back half. And so we see this term lifnei repeated again, ve lifnei. So it's the conjunction form, which means and before. And this is a clever repetition, and normally we just move right past it. We've already covered this term, but the second usage, it's going to unify both halves of the proverb. And it's going to explain that there's a sequence before the sequence, and that there's an actual timeline. So it's not a supplement to the first clause, it's a sharper focus on that first clause. And it establishes that pride wasn't actually where the failure happened. Pride was the midway point. It's not the true starting point. That pride's infant form is going to be here in the second clause, which is haughtiness. And these are not two different bad traits. They're each two different pre-collapse conditions that have to be met. And they want the reader of the proverb to understand and recognize moral precedents, that the results are not accidental again. That before error could become visible, it was internal. It was hidden from sight. And this destruction is actually following a logical pattern. That the gaon, the pride, had an origin point. And that's a haughty spirit. And this is the proverb wanting you to establish the pattern from its very inception, and that a wise person is going to be vigilant to recognize these tendencies in himself so he can nip it in the bud while they're forming. So our next term, kishalon. This is the predicate noun, and this is the actual subject of the second clause, and this is the result of the haughty spirit. Primitive root here means to stumble, to fall, or to totter. Comes from a word kashal, and it's an odd sentence structure because both the first and the second clause each lack verbs. And what this second clause is doing, this is the autopsy, this is the after action report, this is each of these named conditions, they're in past tense. So it's establishing that this final state and these two different catalysts, they're not inseparable, they're never apart, they always come together. And so this idea of kishalon, it's stumbling, and so that implies that there's a certain momentum, that this is where the strength first begins to give way, and is a person losing traction, becoming unstable, but they're just stumbling. Like, intervention is still possible. They're not on the ground yet. They can still straighten up when they're at this stage, but this first clause, the collapse has already happened, which was an external event. But this term that's going to follow here, the haughty spirit, this is moving this person towards this slipping, this kishalon, and this is an internal posture. And the internal disorder of this person is going to bring an external failure if it's not corrected in this stage. And so our next term is gobah, and means elevated or lofty. It's a co-equal noun, and it just means a high place. And this is what is responsible for the stumbling. And again, you have no verb, so there's a verbless equivalency. And it's saying that stumbling and loftiness are both inseparable. They come together. It's a packaged deal. And the primitive root gava, it means to be high or to be tall. And again, so we kind of nerd out here and look at the Hebrew. So there's a nuanced difference between the roots of gava and ga'a, which was in the first clause. And this is the difference between elevated versus exalted. And ga'a, that's the first clause that we saw, that's an assigned height. That's an assessment of majesty. So that's a subjective value, is what you give ga'a. But gava, this is a measurement, and it measures one thing: verticality, just a straight up elevation. And so gava, it's acknowledging that there's like a distance from the ground, that we would say that this person is not grounded. They've got their, nose up in the air. And ga'ah, the self-pride, this is how a person views themselves. But gobah, the one being used here, this is about how one views others. And both of these two things, exalting yourself or having this elevated sense, it creates spatial distance, but the difference is where's the focused aim? Is this, an internal assessment or an external assessment of others? And so tall is a relative term, so it requires a point of reference. Something has to be shorter. And what is this person being taller than? Well, other people. So gova is looking down on others. So probably the best way to understand it would be the idea that this is conceitedness, looking down their nose. It's not enough to be tall, but other people have to be shorter by comparison. So they are condescending. And so what it's saying is that pride is inwardly focused, but loftiness, this is outwardly focused. So it's comparison obsessed. And tall is also a comparative relative term to humility, the Hebrew word anav, which we'll get into later. But humility will make itself low, and gava, this exits this posture and it stands up erectly. So they're taller compared to someone who has a low estimation of themselves. So they're not humble. And this progression in the proverb is creating the instability that will lead to the kishalon, the falling. And so they reject the anava, the humility, the humble lifestyle, and the lower self-image, and they become haughty instead. And so our final term is ruach. This is the spirit. We've talked about this term a lot. It centers very heavily in a lot of Hebrew wisdom culture. And this is going to complete the phrase. This is what is elevated, and it's also what causes us to stumble. There's no primitive root here. This is a primary term. And it means breath or wind. And so the context is that air is moving, and the idea that the ruach is something that's invisible but animated and moving, just like the wind. And symbolically, it means the divine creation in action. So this is our personal spirit, and it's closely associated with emotion, temperament, and mood. And this is going to be the way that your personality is going to express itself. These are your invisible qualities on display. And these are your best and worst tendencies are in your ruach. And the wind is to breath, what the ruach is to the neshama, which we covered in one of the more recent Proverbs. So the idea is identity versus action at the spiritual level. And the ruach becomes a nefesh when it's in a physical vessel. And that's the idea that we've talked about it. The idea of the soul is the spirit in a body. And if the ruach is removed from its vessel, then it returns to this immaterial, non-physical form. And a lot of times what we do is we use this whole imagery and idea that the lev, the heart, is responsible for both components of the soul, the body, and the spirit. And so in the Hebrew wisdom culture, you have a heart and soul, whereas from more Western thinking, you have a mind, body, spirit. They all kind of cover the same area, but it's all about how you assess who and what is doing what. And so the idea with this parent and child imagery that we use on this channel is that the untrained ruach, the untrained spirit, is dangerous. It's like a little child driving a vehicle. And a heart that doesn't love or submit to God is also dangerous, but it will pursue its own desires. It lacks discipline, and it will let the body or the spirit rule. And this will also lead the whole person to ruin. But wisdom is going to seek this right standing of both. They want the heart and the spirit on the same page. And this spirit, the reason we depict it as a child is because it's a new creation. It's learning everything freshly and newly. So it has very poor instincts, and it's very selfish, kind of what psychiatrists might call the ego. So they center themselves in everything, especially their emotional expression. And they do not choose discipline voluntarily, these little ruachs. So this has to all be enforced through willpower from the will of the heart, the lev. And the ruach of all things is particularly prone to pride and arrogance. But we need to refocus back on this particular proverb lesson. Just had to explain what the ruach is in general. But to be high in spirit doesn't necessarily have to be visible or vocal the way that pride is. A person who's got this inner disposition of a lofty spirit, it may not be visible, but so outwardly they can act modest, but inwardly they're just dismissing correction the entire time. They can appear nice and have pleasant interactions, but they don't actually consider other people's opinions to be valid. So they don't take in any of the wisdom they have, and they don't boast outward to the world, but inside quietly they think they're hot stuff. And this high in spirit, they have to pass through this phase first. This is becoming conceited, and this will eventually move from being conceited and progress to full on prideful. And so like wind, these feelings, this idea of a lofty position, it's going to animate and fill him, and this inner wind is going to start driving his outer life. And then it'll become visible by the actions he takes. And particularly the disposition will take the form in how he treats others. And that's what this proverb is actually placing the origin of all of these errors is it's framing the timeline in reverse. It's saying that this was the real error, is that he started to think this way, and that before any of these things could happen, this had to happen first. And if there's no disruption, then it ends in destruction. So now that we understand what each of these words mean individually, we're going to look a little bit closer to the structure of the proverb itself. How is it chosen to be written? And you'll see that there's even more inner wisdom when we look at the proverb up close, and we'll see that Solomon was this incredibly gifted writer, just how he framed these things in comparison and working with each other. And we'll miss these nuances if we read the proverb too quickly. Okay, so when we take a little bit closer look at this, we're going to look at how these concepts are grouped together. And the first comparison that we're going to see are going to deal with the flaws of the posture, where we see elevation versus humility. So humility is not actually named in the proverb, but its two antonyms are, which is pride and loftiness. So pride will focus on the self, whereas humility will decenter the self. And loftiness is very concerned about comparing itself to others, but humility requires no comparative reference. It's just a state of being. And then the elevation, this is a competitively minded posture, but humility doesn't need to win. And so as a result of that, you're going to end up with two different types of perspective. So you'll have a distorted perspective that comes from the pride and the loftiness, whereas you'll have a clear perspective if you're down in humbleness and humility. There's also two different levels of risk. So when you are prideful, that's going to lead you to the destruction, the collapse. If you're lofty, it's going to lead you to slipping up. But if you're humble, it will lead you to stability. And that's a great segue to our second concept grouping, which is the two different types of destabilizing actions, which is kishalon and shevet. So loftiness, this is what's going to build the tower. And then pride is what's going to collapse it. And so the loftiness is the scaffolding, but the pride is the completed project. The loftiness is this pride in its infancy, but this full-blown gaon, this is pride in its full maturity. And if someone is stumbling, they can still recover, but they just have to stop the self-elevation. But with destruction, they cannot recover. The opportunity passed. The consequences have already been realized. This is a past tense form. And this final fall was not random. It could have been interrupted, but the time to have done it would have been in that stumbling phase. Third concept that we see grouped is the sequencing, which is the preliminary state versus the finished state. And we see this clever use of that term before, lifnei, two different times. And it states that there's two completed forms. The first one is high in spirit, and the second one is full of pride. And it means that there were times before either one of these things existed, and that this evolved into this thing. And the person is becoming these things. They were not born this way, so they pass through stages. And disrupting this preliminary stage is how you prevent this final stage. And then the last of the concepts that we see grouped is this idea of the spirit and the heart. And, the heart is not listed, only the spirit is, but this is a big part of why we hammer this idea that the lev has to take precedence and it has to rule over the spirit initially, because the heart's not in the picture, which means the spirit is the one taking the lead. The heart is either agreeing and is haughty itself as well, or it's passive and it doesn't institute regulation over the spirit. And so either way, moral development is missing. This is the spirit, the Ruach, behaving in its natural chaotic state. It's unguided and uncorrected, and it's going to take this entire person to destruction because the lev did not do its job. So now that we understand the words themselves, we understand the arrangement internally of the proverb, we can see that many times Solomon, he's got 3 and 4, sometimes 5, even more than that, simultaneous trains of thought going, and he's condensed it in these small forms of, this was 7 words. And we could talk about these forever, but we do have to move on. So Proverbs 16:18, pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Translation, I give it a 10 out of 10. Like I said, super famous proverb here. Lots of people know this one. And we're going to look at 3 different quick snapshot takeaways. So number 1, humility is stabilizing. It prevents the stumbling in the first place. It keeps one on the ground, which means it prevents pride, which means it prevents destruction. Number 2, if you do become prideful, you will come to ruin. It is not a question of if, it is a question of when. And this untended spirit is going to gravitate towards conceitedness. So if you want to avoid this destruction, you better learn how to keep that little spirit in check. And number 3, remain vigilant in this area of life at all times. You need to always be on the lookout to purge it in its infant stage, which is conceitedness. That's the highness of spirit, so that you don't trip or fall completely. And the way that you do this is you develop that lev, that heart, which we're going to talk about later on in the video. So the thing that we do now that we've wrapped up the definition part, we move to the fun part, which is the guided talks. Okay, so the first of the guided talks that we do here is what we call the dad talk. And we call it the dad talk because that's precisely what it is. It's fatherly advice. It's how we take the actual wisdom that's in this proverb and we look at a way that it can be practically applied. If you just take this wisdom and you begin doing these things, you will instantly live as a wiser person. You will have a new tool in your toolkit that you can use to navigate life with. So this is a proverb about pride. Couldn't be any more clear than that. It's all over it. And the first thing that we look at when we think of pride, we have these famous sayings like the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And the reason why this is so true and every culture on earth has noticed this phenomenon is because the moment that someone gets too big, they eventually find the thing that will be bigger than they are. And, as a kid, I grew up watching boxing. I always loved it. And, the heavyweight champion, he has to project this aura of invincibility. And, so he's walking down to the ring and he's got his big giant gold belt and huge muscles. And they're showing this highlight reel of him knocking everyone out. And he's got this intimidating stare on his face when he looks across at his opponent. And man, these guys, they just, at their peak, they all seem like the toughest guy in the world. But you know what? Every single one of them, they all eventually find someone who beats them. And if they can lose their fight, you can lose yours. So no matter how good you are at something or what skill or whatever it is that you think that you've got that makes you hot stuff, recognize it's not. It's going to fail you at some point if you rely on it. And no matter who you are in life, you're going to encounter things that are bigger than you that is going to cause you to rely. You need to have God in the picture to help you get it through it. And that prideful person, they're just never even going to seek it out and they're going to fail. Number two, in your personal life, comeuppance. Everybody hates arrogant people. Everyone loves watching them finally lose and get what's coming to them. And it's just part of our inner wiring is if you are a prideful person, if you are a boastful person, if you are a conceited person, everyone around you is going to secretly hate you and hope that you get your comeuppance, that you have a downfall. And if you can just remain down to earth and a humble person, you're going to form better friendships. People are going to like you more. Life is going to be a lot easier. You're not going to have so many like secret enemies. So that's another reason why you want to stay humble is because you'll get along with people better. And then the third thing that we'll look at in this dad talk is this whole idea of conceitedness. This is where it all starts. High in spirit, this is a spatial measurement. And it begins by comparing yourself to others, seeing other people as small. And that will make you see yourself as large. And so conceit, this is internal and it becomes pride when it starts being acted on. And if you become conceited, you can't help. You will treat people poorly. And this is also where humility starts, is in this internal state that you decide, I'm not going to do this. And the moment you catch yourself being impressed with yourself, humility is going to bring you right back down and just always let yourself be grounded. Because conceitedness, this is going to ruin on many, many levels. And if it's allowed to go unchecked, just like what this proverb says it's going to do, it will ruin you. You will collapse. Okay, and so the next of the guided talks is what we call the lev talk. The lev is the Hebrew word for the heart, and we discuss it in almost every video. From the Hebrew wisdom culture perspective, it's actually the heart that makes all the decisions. And so what we do here is we locate the wisdom that's in the proverb, and instead of applying it outwardly, we take the principles and we use it internally to govern ourselves, because this is just like we would use the wisdom to navigate the world, this is how we use the wisdom to navigate our own worst tendencies. Wisdom is always about self-improvement, and that's what the lev does. And this proverb is a textbook example of disordered inner formation. And proverb is saying that this is what it looks like when the spirit takes the lead and the heart is asleep, which is why we use these background images that we do at the channel, because this is how a person begins to fail internally. Is the spirit isn't the only thing that can have pride. The heart can as well, but it looks different when the pride is in the heart versus the spirit. So there is a sister proverb to this, which is before destruction, the heart of a man is haughty, and before honor is humility. Proverbs 18:12. And we will get around to doing that one eventually. And it's part of why we read it in Hebrew, because it teaches about these inner distinctions of our inner architecture. And so this one, we're going to look at what pride in the spirit, does to a person. It's the Proverbs in advanced diagnostic. It identifies as the cause of the sickness. And pride in spirit begins with conceit. It's being very impressed with one's own self. That's the first part. But then the second part is disdain and contempt for others. And between these two things, that the spirit will grow in loftiness if it allows either of these two emotions or assessments begin to form and grow in itself. Is you can't help but become condescending. And that's where this whole idea of gobah, the elevation, it's going to distort the self-view. And it's a relative term. So it requires something to compare itself to. What do they compare themselves to? The neighbor. And humility is therefore relational. The humble person They're not even interested in evaluating others for comparison to themselves. They're more interested in recognizing and working on their own flaws. They will see flaws in themselves before they go look for it in others. And this is the action that you will take that'll actually cut off the spirit of the past and prevent it from becoming elevated, prevents it from even forming. It's going to keep that spirit low. And the heart, the lev, this is what also, it houses the will. And that's mainly so that it can enforce its will over the spirit, teach the spirit how to do this thing, to be lower in its own self-estimation. And external things like failure, they can create the conditions for humility to form by bringing you low. But even if something has caused embarrassment or loss of status or even a catastrophe, it still doesn't produce humility, because humility is something that's inwardly chosen. It's not externally imposed. And that's why a man can be brought low but still remain proud anyway. And the whole idea is that only a man can humble himself. No one or anything else can. Him exclusively. He's the only one who can do it. God can apply this tremendous pressure and make the choice more obvious to him, but the choice is still the man's to make or to refuse. And that's why the Bible has so many verses that begin with a commandment: humble yourselves. And it's an internal action. It's what begins in the heart, and it's enforced upon the spirit. And this is the parent taking the keys away from the kid and saying, no, I'm driving this car. And this is why humility is stabilizing. This is why development of the lev is so important, is it prevents the immature spirit from leading the entire person to destruction. And the engaged heart, this lev that's committed to scripture, that loves God, it keeps the spirit low enough to avoid this destruction that this proverb is speaking about. And this lev that seeks, then submits to the wisdom that it's not their own. This is how a lev functions properly. And this is why we emphasize this transformation so much, is let the heart lead. Let it become informed by wisdom, let it love God, and let it engage in scripture. Okay, and the place where we finish out the video is what we call the Ruach talk. So, clearly this is a proverb about the Ruach. The Ruach is the spirit. And when we get to this point where we're looking, where does the wisdom in the proverb actually speak to the spirit? Where do we see this universal message from the Bible, from page 1, that God's ways, they're always the same, yesterday, today, tomorrow, forever. And particularly, we're looking for this symmetry between the Old and the New Testament, which means we're looking for the gospel. We're looking for Jesus in the proverb. Do we see something about something he taught, something that he modeled in his life? And reading this proverb, it's actually like examining the life of Jesus in reverse. He comes from the highest place possible. He's worshipped by angels. And then he's born in one of the lowest places possible, a manger, a feeding trough in the back of a barn. And it was not so he could be honored and loved and exalted. He did it so he could be spat on, abused, and killed, and to deliver a message that would preserve the soul from shiver, from destruction, and to model a life that when it's followed will prevent kishalon, this constant slipping and falling, if we just follow his ways. Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. Isaiah's prophecies call him Eved, servant, and he even washes his own disciples' feet. This tremendous outward show of humility. And so many of his parables are about humility. It's a central teaching of his. And he was always dealing with his competitive disciples who were obsessed with rank and position. And so there were no shortages of directions to go with a spiritual message of where's this proverb showing or demonstrating something about Jesus. But, Jesus taught on multiple occasions throughout the Gospels that anyone who exalts himself will be humbled. And he repeatedly tells his disciples to assume the lowliest places and to stop being concerned with honor and prestige and titles, and just stop pestering and questioning him about greatness and hierarchy. He always, every time they would do it, he would point and guide them back to this idea of humility. And Jesus' primary message and mission was to provide this path of salvation to everyone, to preserve every soul from destruction. He calls this the way. And the most famous sermon he ever recorded was the Sermon on the Mount, and especially the section called the Beatitudes. He could have led with anything on that sermon, but he leads with, blessed are the poor in spirit. 2 verses later, he says, the meek are blessed. And he promises that these are the 2 types who will experience the kingdom of heaven, that these will be the ones who actually inherit the earth, which is God dwelling among them in this world to come, this prophecy from the very beginning. But not every single person who sees or interacts with Jesus does it in this way. Christ is visible to the humble because their posture is fit to receive a king, and the prideful can't see him because they refuse the terms by which he comes. It's not complicated. The prideful person just simply doesn't want to be lorded over. And That is what is always at the heart of a person who either accepts or rejects Jesus. Jesus means you change. Jesus means you are wrong. He is right. And because of this, the gospel is very offensive. It's very provocative to a prideful person. It says you are a sinner and you need salvation. It doesn't say you're slightly mistaken. It says you're guilty. And a proud man can't handle that message. I spent a huge part of my life as an atheist, and I thought it was for all these different reasons. No, no, no. It was simply being a proud person. And the heart, this love, subconsciously knows that encountering Jesus means you have to choose one or the other, self-rule or submission. There's no way to partially apply Jesus. He's either Lord of all or he's Lord of nothing. And the proud of heart will flatly say no thank you to this offer. And in the high in spirit, they won't even recognize the need. And they feel self-sufficient. They feel very rich in spirit as opposed to poor. And they are not meek. And so because of that, they're unaware that they are slipping. And it's for this reason that pride is called the mother of all sin. Because just like this proverb frames it, pride and conceit have distorted spatial reasoning. They see themselves as higher than they are, which means they see God as lower than he is. And they don't see themselves requiring mercy or salvation. They've got it together. And they can't enter the kingdom of heaven because that door is very close to the ground. You have to bow your head to enter through that door. Jesus is not here to decorate a sinful life. He's here to end it and to replace it with a new life. And in the lofty in spirit can't see it because their perspective isn't grounded. And they don't realize they're falling. Kishalon, but they are. And this initiating sequence starts where this proverb says it does, the haughty spirit. But it never ends there. That same sermon, Jesus also says the gate is wide and the road is broad that leads to destruction. Shever is probably the word he was using at the time. And he's saying that I'm the only one who leads away from that destruction. And the main reason pride is so bad for the spirit is that it blocks the precursor of redemption, conviction of one's own sinfulness. And it's deadly because it protects the sin from repentance. And this is what actually ultimately destroys a person. So sure, on the surface, this channel is about wisdom. We do practical linguistic study of Hebrew, and it's fun. But this channel will always remain evangelical. It's why we always end on a gospel-centered teaching of every single proverb. For the unbeliever, you made it this far into this video. You cannot imagine the peace that breaks out when you lower your spirit, when you surrender this way, when you listen to the words of this man. And that would be what I would beg you to do, is to not allow a lofty spirit or proud heart to prevent you from having this joy-filled life. Don't choose destruction. Select poverty of spirit, and you will see your entire inner life bloom. And this is what billions of people for thousands of years experience every time they come to Christ. They testify again and again and again that this is what happens when you humble yourself and you accept this man and you follow him in his teachings and you let them write themselves on your heart and you allow that to guide you for the rest of your life. So yes, wisdom is great. It keeps us away from trouble, but it is not, cannot, and will never be a substitution for Jesus. And I think that's a good spot to end this video. I hope you got a lot out of it and that it was enjoyable for you. The world is a dark place, like we say. It needs the light of God's gospel to go out into it. It's also a place with a lot of foolishness and a tremendous lack of wisdom. So it needs the Mishle, the incredible wisdom that's in the Bible within the Bible, the book Proverbs. And that's just real easy evangelism, is to let someone you know that you found this channel and that you're getting lots of cool information out of it, because that's kind of our promise, is we sort of compare it to God wants you to pass this test. He wants you to ace it. So he gives you all these answers ahead of time, which is the wisdom that's in the Mishle. And they're wonderful. They help you pass your test, but you help someone else pass their test when you pass it along. And if you have a particular proverb that you would like to see broken down in this way, you can email me, that Mishlei guy, ThatMishlei, gmail.com. I'll put it in the queue and get around to it. But life is very painful if you live in folly, and God's word is there to keep us out of those patterns. And you'll continue to make mistakes in life. But if you listen to Lady Wisdom's voice today, having this lofty spirit, this proud heart, heading towards destruction, no longer has to be this. Shalom, shalom.